So a couple of days ago, I teased that I was working on a kinetic bolt of fragmentation Deadeye. And over the last few days, I have been progressing on getting this path of building done. It has kind of evolved into a mostly kinetic bolt, but also kinetic blast for clear character. And I went from some pretty insanely expensive gear at first to now refining it down to significantly more reasonable gear, and that's what you're seeing in the background. Now, two things of note about the footage that you're seeing right now. One, I am sorry that it is extremely laggy at some points. That is just my computer not being able to handle the sheer amount of projectiles and explosions that are happening with the density of the map that I'm trying to clear. And two, the character in the background is pretty scuffed, and the footage that you're seeing was not deathless by any means. I'm on the third or fourth iteration of this build, and I've spent quite a bit more currency than I'm happy to even admit, and most of it unfortunately does not seem to want to sell back into the market. So I'm pretty poor, my character's pretty scuffed. However, I think that POB is at a point where it's good enough that I think I can at least share it. However, most likely here in the coming days, I'll have a full finalized build guide with all the correct little tweaks and numbers that should be good for most people to play. However, I knew there was quite a few of you that have been asking, hey, can I just get any POB so I can try playing this character already? I just want to give it a shot. So here we are, and this is it. Now, if you're new to the channel, make sure that you subscribe, and without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so this is my character. Screen cancer, yep. And yeah, big screen cancer. As you saw in the previous video, there is an unbelievable amount of projectiles that fly around all over the place, and let me kind of explain what that is. So if we look at this kinetic bolt of fragmentation, it's pretty similar to normal kinetic bolt where, you know, instead of forking, it just does the little zigzag stuff. However, there's one particular difference between this skill and the normal version of kinetic bolt. And that's the last line in green there that says multiple of these projectiles can hit the same target. This fundamentally changes the entire ability. Normally in Path of Exile, shotgunning is not something that you can do, meaning that if I attack with this, only one of those projectiles normally can hit the same target. With this ability, however, if you can see, there's like 6 or 7 projectiles and like 10 or so whenever I have Dying Sun up. All of those projectiles are going to be able to hit the same target. Now, when we combine this with Sniper's Mark, which makes it so that projectiles that hit enemies split towards 5 additional targets, more with effect, if we're hitting 10 or so times and those projectiles are splitting 5 to 8 times, that means that we're getting an absolutely absurd amount of hits. And because we're using returning projectiles, as long as we're standing and hitting directly on top of the enemy, pretty much all of those projectiles will hit. What this ends up with is that craziness that you saw previously, where essentially the entire screen is bleached white with those projectiles. This just leads to some absurd circumstances that do all kinds of crazy stuff, and yeah, it's relatively busted. Now beyond that, we are using Kinetic Blast, and the reason we're using Kinetic Blast is simply because Kinetic Bolt, when you are using it normally, as you can see, it doesn't have the greatest clear. It can function, however, the problem that you'll run into is when you're fighting like blue mobs or white mobs that don't have Sniper's Mark on them, the clear it's all that you see right here, right? It's just this little tiny wave here, and those return projectiles are only like one little projectile hitting. So it's much, much smaller than attacking with these that are returning, going through, making explosions for every single time that they hit, and essentially just clearing the entire screen. Now beyond that, the next skill that you might see on my bar is Berserk, and this build actually can use Berserk better than most builds I've ever played, even in current day PoE where Combs is nerfed. That is because of the outraged boreal wood tincture that I'm using. Now, you don't have to use boreal wood. The freeze one is more expensive here. You can use pretty much any of the tinctures that you want, but freeze is quite nice. You'll see that it says 14% chance to gain 1 rage when you hit a rare or unique enemy. So if you remember what I said about Kinetic Bolt hitting like, you know, 10 times 9 per attack, and I attack like 5 or 6 times per second, plus with Berserk it's even faster. This has no cap on the amount of rage that it can generate per second like some other versions do. This is just unlimited. So essentially, as long as you are attacking an enemy with this ability, I've had my rage stay at 50 with Berserk going for like 10 plus seconds at this point. It's pretty insane. Movement skill, we're using Shield Charge. When you have Berserk and everything going on, Shield Charge moves around pretty quickly. We're also using Frost Blink to be able to cross gaps. For our auras, we are currently using Precision, Purity of Elements, Grace, and Dread Banner. Precision, Crit, Accuracy are both good for this build. Purity of Elements is an interesting one because this build actually struggles a little bit with resistances. I was using Wrath before, but Wrath is honestly just such a terrible aura that it was really hard to justify using that ability. It's just so understated compared to anger, and then horrifically understated compared to hatred. It's just really, really hard to suggest it. So we're using Purity of Elements. This means that we're immune to elemental ailments, and this gives us a bunch of resistances, so we don't need to worry about like Storm Shroud or Ancestral Visions or anything like that. Grace, we are a right side of the tree build with evasion. Grace allows us to get up to like 95% evasion, pretty obvious. Same thing with Dread Banner. We're using this to reduce the accuracy of nearby enemies, allowing us to scale our evasion a little bit further. And then we do have a Divine Blessing haste. Now, the Divine Blessing on this build is a little weird because we do use up quite a bit of our energy shield to be able to cast this ability. However, as it currently is right now, you can cast this before you start fighting a boss. And on the skill tree, I have taken this node, which is Ghost Dance, meaning anytime any spell hits you, you can refresh your haste. It's relatively consistent. I haven't had too many problems with it. And with that, for the most part, your haste, which lasts 13.5 seconds, it's available pretty much all the time. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is Sigil of Power. So the thing about Sigil of Power is that this gives us 8 to 153 added lightning damage per stage. And the idea behind Sigil of Power is that when you cast it, it starts at stage 1. So with the amount of times that this build is hitting, we're talking like 90 to 100 every time you attack on single target, adding in 8 to 153 added damage, even without any stages, is just an absurd amount of damage. Like, for example, if we just look at tooltip DPS, which isn't accurate, of course, it's like 60,000, right? And then we add this in, and we're doing 67,000. So this isn't accurate, but in PoB, it's like 10% more damage per stage. However, there's kind of one thing that I still haven't 100% figured out, and I'm actively working on it. But that's Sigil of Power. It gains stages whenever you spend a certain amount of mana. However, it has to be mana. It can't be energy shield. So the idea is that maybe if we used a lower level Sigil of Power, and I need to figure out the level that works here, we could potentially get more overall damage with this. It already lasts like 20 seconds, so I'm not really worried about the duration of it. But as you can see, if I put down Sigil of Power, cast my aura, and then start attacking,
my mana is gone.
Even though I'm spending mana now, and I would be leeching and spending more mana if I was attacking an enemy, it's pretty hard to even get a single stack, like a single stage of this ability going, right? Like, it's just not really happening, yeah? I'm spending a lot of energy shield, not a ton of mana, and I didn't even get a single stage. However, if we flip this around and use a level 1 Sigil of Power, which I'll have to take the cast 1 damage taken out, and then I use my aura, pop the Sigil of Power, and then start attacking, you'll notice that I start getting stages because the amount of mana required is significantly lower. So now, after a couple of seconds, I'm at 4 stages, and this will last for quite a while. I mean, 4 stages of level 1 Sigil of Power is not as good as 1 stage of the later one, but I mean, it's getting pretty close. So if I can do like level 5 or level 10 or something like that, it might just be significantly better, but that's something that I still need to figure out. So I talked a little bit about this with Kinetic Bolt. On big bosses, you will want to just hard cast the Sniper's Mark. It never removes itself except for like Shaper, who goes invulnerable and stuff like that. But for the most part, you can just leave this on Mark on hit support. Sniper's Mark is just a bunch of extra damage, a bunch of extra splits, all kinds of good stuff for this build. Not really much else to say there. Now, we are using a cast 1 damage taken Immortal Call. Notably, Ralakesh's is very powerful, but you only count as having the charges. You don't actually have them. So we don't get like a super extended duration Immortal Call or anything like that. It's just that we don't have armor, so you know, that one is off the table, and Immortal Call is still a little bit better than even like Steel Skin and things like that, so seemed to just be better to go with this. And when it's linked with increased duration, it still lasts 1.6 seconds, which is enough to save you from like a successive hit after you take 1 big hit. Now, let's talk a little bit about the gear. So this build, you might notice that the helmet is missing, and that is for a very particular reason. It's because we are using Dance with Death. The way that Dance with Death works is that you can't use helmets, but your critical strike is lucky, your damage with critical strikes is lucky. However, enemies damage with critical strikes against you is lucky as well. Crit maps, relatively dangerous for this build. So the idea is that when we do have this Dance with Death, we can scale things like volatility as well as a whole bunch of other stuff and just get an absolutely insane amount of lightning damage, scaling essentially to the moon. You might notice that things like lightning damage tend to have a very wide range, right? Like a very, very high top end and a very low bottom end. When you give it this lucky chance where it rolls twice, lightning damage is extremely powerful. So because of that, on top of what we're using already, we've added in Marylene's Fallacy. Now, our crit chance is probably around like 70, maybe 80% with everything going. But I mean, essentially, even though we're giving up 20 or 30% crit chance, we're getting like 240% crit multi, which is an absolutely insane amount. So this ends up being pretty worth. Now you might see Wrathfith Globe and think that I'm a little crazy. However, Kinetic Bolt has one additional line on it, which says increases and reductions to spell damage also applied to attack damage from this skill at 250% of their value. You might notice that Wrathfith Globe is giving 5% increased spell damage per 100 player maximum life. This build can get to roughly 4,000 if you level up a little bit more than I have. So what that means is that this shield is 10% max life, some spell block, some energy shield, and like, I think 200% increased spell damage. Now, most likely you don't need to use Wrathfith Globe. You could use like a really well-crafted rare shield, which is something I'm gonna investigate, but for now, it's sticking with Wrathfith Globe because we don't really cast that many spells, so the whole sacrifice 10% of your life doesn't really do anything to us. Beyond that, we are using a crafted one. Now, there was a time when I was going to be using a Piscator's. I did use a Piscator's for quite a while, and it works relatively okay, but this wand, which is just fractured attack speed, and I put like 3 woe essences on it, is like a 20% damage upgrade over Piscator's. And this is an almost perfect Piscator's, right? Perfect attack speed, perfect crit, and some accuracy, of course, and almost perfect increased elemental damage with attacks. So yeah, this wand, which cost me essentially nothing, was like a 17 to 20% overall damage up. Now this is probably the weakest part of my build because I just haven't really crafted a better wand yet. But I could get another 20 or 30% overall damage to my character right now just by finishing this wand. Other than that, we do have these amethyst rings. These are just fractured resist amethyst rings that I crafted with strength essences just to have enough strength on the build. Just resist, strength, life, as good as you can get. The chest piece is a fractured tier 3 spell suppression chest piece. And I just used chaos essences on it until I got lightning resistance, and I managed to get life on it as well. I think the breakpoint on this build for having life versus having the mastery is about 95, so this was pretty good. And then some implicits, which I haven't finished yet. We are using Ralakesh, like I said before, just overall really powerful boots these days. You essentially just get max all charges at all times. And then we're using Darkness Enthroned. Jewels like this, or jewels like these, are just insanely strong for this build. Like, they're absolutely ridiculously strong. You just get so much added lightning damage, life, attack speed. You can also get resistances and such here to fill out your tree. Darkness Enthroned with these for this build, just kind of like cheating. It's very, very strong. And then lastly, we've got Thunder Fist. These have been pretty popular recently. They give you increased effect of lightning ailments, which means we can get our shock even on Ubers up to like 20%, maybe a little bit more sometimes. And then they have level 30 added lightning damage. So this is the reason why we don't need a 6-link chest piece. We've just got our main gems slotted into this, as well as volatility, returning projectile support. And then when I take Kinetic Blast out, I'm putting in Awakened Lightning Pin for some lightning exposure, as well as lightning penetration. This is what gives us all the damage that you saw previously. For our flasks, we are using increased effect, reduced duration flasks for clear, because we just generate an absolutely insane amount of charges since we are taking this mastery here. So we're using that on all 3 of our normal flasks. We have use when charge reach full, we've got crit, we've got attack speed, and we've got evasion here. Now, I did already speak about this tincture a little bit, but there is some other stuff to talk about this tincture as well. If we look at what this does with our ascendancy, which is going to be Nature's Concoction, this makes it so that we gain charges as well as 30% increased effect when used if you've hit an enemy with a weapon recently. So the idea is that since we're using this, we're getting a bunch of crit and evasion from it, but with Dying Sun, we get 30% effect from this ascendancy, we get 10% from this node and this node, which brings us to 40, and then we also have natural remedies, which gives us an additional 10%. That means we've got 50% increased effect on this Dying Sun, which should increase the skills fired to 3, as well as give us a bunch of AoE for when we're attacking with Kinetic Blast. So overall makes Dying Sun extremely powerful. I know it is a little expensive, but it is what it is. Now, talking about the tree a little bit, this is a pretty wild looking tree, if I'm going to be honest with you. It is kind of a hybrid between a basic like Ellie attack, like ranged attack build like you'd see on a normal Deadeye, like a lightning arrow or something like that, and kind of just moved up here to get some of these wand nodes essentially. We really needed increases and reductions to spell damage also apply to attacks while wielding a wand, because we have that for Kinetic Bolt. However, Kinetic Blast does not have that. So we need that mastery to be able to scale the damage of Kinetic Blast properly. And then of course we want an additional projectile that gives us like 11 additional hits or something crazy. And then while we were over here, spell damage is really good for this build. Prodigal Perfection and the node before it ended up being really strong, and we needed some more mana reservation efficiency, so that was pretty good. Otherwise, tree is relatively standard. Nothing super crazy going on here. You do need a little bit of pierce because the projectile has to go through and come back. When clearing, I do keep this node as well, and if I leveled up, I'd just put that node in. But beyond that, nothing really too crazy here. So let's talk about keystones real quick, because there's two interesting ones here. A lot of people see Wind Dancer and they think that this keystone is just really bad. They're like, why would I ever want to take 20% more damage? Well, the idea here is that if you have like 85 to 90% evasion, this node is just a straight upgrade in pretty much every circumstance. You would have to be getting hit by like 50 attacks a second to have this not be worthwhile. So the idea is that you take less attack damage if you haven't been hit by attack recently, which is 4 seconds. And then when you do get hit by something, you gain 10% more chance to evade attacks, and you get 20% more attack damage taken if you've been hit by an attack recently. So as long as in that 4 seconds you aren't getting hit roughly 20 times by attacks, it'll go back to not having been attacked recently, and you'll gain the bonus again without just randomly dying to it. Wind Dancer is really powerful if you have super high evasion, super powerful keystone. The other one that we're using that might be a little weird to see is going to be Point Blank, because you might notice that I have Far Shot as well. I haven't really come to a concrete conclusion here, but in my initial testing, it does seem like in general having Point Blank and Far Shot is better on single target and kind of on clear. It depends on how you look at it. So the problem with this ability is that with Far Shot, when you use an ability, it goes out and it comes back, right? That whole distance traveled is counted. So while I'm clearing, typically I'm using Kinetic Blast, right? And those Kinetic Blasts, as they go out and as they come back, are going to be doing more damage. Same thing with Kinetic Bolt here. But the problem is that when you actually look at this, if you see how far these projectiles are going out, they're coming to about here and then they're coming back, right? So the problem is the projectile's going out, and say that it's hitting this unicorn right here, right? So it's hitting the target, it splits from the target, goes out to about here, and then comes back in. I'm not 100% certain that it's going actually 70 distance. It might be, but from just the raw feel perspective, having both of them has felt better. I'll try to do a little bit more testing on this, but I mean, worst case, you just drop this node. But in general, it has felt better to me to have this node than to not have the node. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, I'll finalize all of this sometime this week, most likely, and then get like a full build guide once I've got everything all together. You can expect all the normal stuff from me, leveling trees and gear sets and all that kind of stuff whenever that full video is out. But I just figured I'd at least get something to you guys so you can play it before you get tired of playing the league. Because I know a bunch of you have been asking me for this POV. So remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in Ray class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.